I analyzed 700 deals before I bought my first one. Knowing that you have a plan and also speaking the language are two things that create an excellent amount of credibility, because not everyone can talk about amortizations and terms and interest rates and what is your business plan for a real estate transaction. That's not a skill set that's widely available because not everybody studies it. If you go in with your business plan on this is how I'm going to increase rents, I'm planning on spending this much per unit, even if you're wrong, they can see that you have some sort of plan and maybe you've done some research and they can give you a little bit of guidance there. When you're more focused on the input rather than the output, then ironically, that output increases. So the more that you have that mindset of forcing appreciation of value add, the more able that you are to then boost your returns for your investors, do more deals, get more deal flow going.
Welcome to the Hybrid Real Estate Professional Podcast, where we dive deep into the intersection of career, family, and finances. Learn the mindsets, tips, and strategies to help you on your personal journey to build a life of abundance and purpose for you and your family. Now here's your host, Aaron Amin. Welcome back to another episode of the Hybrid Real Estate Professional Podcast. Today I'm joined by one of the hardest working, most passionate investors I have come across, AJ Smith. After only a couple years in the workforce, AJ was able to achieve financial freedom through real estate investing by age 23. He did this by having a clear vision, working hard to build a strong base of knowledge, and putting himself in the right rooms right out of the gate. He went from house hacking quadplexes to taking down large commercial deals. We break down all the major pillars that led to his early success and how you can apply them in your own investing journey. This is one you'll want to listen to top to bottom, trust me. Without further delay, let's get into it. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Hybrid Real Estate Professional Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Mr. AJ Smith. He's an up-and-coming investor. He's done an enormous amount in his brief time as an investor. He's in his mid-20s, but he's already, I don't even know how many units you have. I'm going to let you introduce yourself here in a minute, but you've been catching fire. I met you because we both are invest in the same market in the Quad Cities in Iowa, which just so happens to be where AJ's from. But before I butcher your intro anymore, AJ, let's have you introduce yourself to my audience in your own words.
Yeah, well, hey, everybody. Thanks for having me on the podcast. AJ Smith, like you had mentioned, started out in small multifamily real estate. I learned about real estate in college through various books and podcasts, and I just dove into it. I always like to say, I think I analyzed 700 deals before I bought my first one. Part of that was analysis paralysis, not being able or willing to pull the trigger, but part of it was like saving up enough money while I was in college, doing side jobs and selling plasma and stuff to buy that first property. And bought that first property coming out of college. It was a fourplex. And that was essentially my strategy for a few years. I just looked for cash flowing fourplexes and duplexes inside my home market, my backyard. And I used that to grow a portfolio while I was working for a large grocery retailer for about 2 years. I saved about 80% of my income working for that retailer. And I used it to buy 19 apartment units inside of my home market, which, as you mentioned earlier, is the Quad Cities.
Awesome. So the quadplexes, were you doing those as house hacks or did you buy those as investment properties?
It was a mix. Yeah. So I had a couple house hacks. I had a few investment properties. And I found out house hacks obviously are fantastic. I still have my first one. And that one I had an interest rate of, this is back in the day, 2021. I think my interest rate on that was 2.75% because I was living in it. And I had a 30-year amortization on that project as well. So it's fixed 30 years, 2.75%. So whenever I'm speaking to people, especially new people, I try to recommend house hacking because your debt's going to be much better. It's a good stepping stone into landlording. So you understand, here are the mechanics behind it. Here are some of the things I have to keep in mind in terms of maintenance schedules, talking to tenants, getting leases done. It's a really good training manual module. And then I think getting into more forced appreciation, like buying properties that are flippable, getting into larger scale properties, I think that's a great next step after you've done a house hack.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's important to cut your teeth on something before you try and dive into a massive multi-million dollar deal. It's not to say that you can't do that,
Yep.
but you want to get your potential mistakes or learning curve out of the way on something a little lower stakes, especially before you start bringing in other people's money and trying to level up into a different game entirely. So
Yep.
it makes sense that you started there. And like you said, you got a 2.75% interest rate, 30 years. Hard to argue with that.
Yeah.
Do you still have house hacking as part of your kind of ongoing playbook while you're working on everything else, or have you moved on?
Yeah, still part of my strategy. I'm house hacking right now. So I bought a great condo in a great market, and the value of this has already appreciated pretty well since I bought it about a year and a half ago. And I have other folks who are like traveling nurses, midterm rentals, help to pay that mortgage while I'm growing this commercial real estate portfolio.
Yeah, to me, I have 3 young kids now, but if I knew what I know now back in my 20s, I would have done that as many times as I possibly could. My wife and I did do 3 separate live then rent rentals. But again, that was like right up until when we had kids, and that's hard to do once you got the family.
Yep.
But I applaud you for recognizing that opportunity. So then you said you hit analysis paralysis and you analyzed 700 deals before you bought your first rental. What was going through your mind at that time? So first of all, getting in the reps is one of the most important parts, right? Because some people hit analysis paralysis just by reading the first chapter of a Bigger Pockets book. Analyzing deals, you're at least a few steps down the funnel to where you're actually looking at real properties. But where did you find the most friction before you were able to actually pull the trigger and buy your first property?
Submitting offers 100%. And I think part of it was probably justified. I was in college. I didn't have a full-time income. So submitting offers for the first like 2 years that I was looking at it probably didn't make much sense. But as I got to the end of my senior year, I had a job offer locked up. I had a source of income that was going to come in very soon. I was pre-approved based on that source of income. So those dominoes started to line up as I also was gaining that experience. And then probably that spring that I was going to graduate, then it started making sense to make offers. So I think I made 5 offers, 4 offers. They got rejected, every single one after another. I'd get super excited. I'd be like, yeah, okay, we're going to make cash flow. It's going to be a great property. And then rejected. And then the 5th property that I submitted an offer on. And again, mind you, I had analyzed 700 properties and offered on 5. There's a lot that I filtered through, but the 5th property that I made an offer on, I got accepted. And that was my first house.
I love it. Yes, I think it was Brandon Turner who had the triangle of skills, right? Knowledge, money, and hustle. And at the beginning of anyone's journey, especially if you're young, usually you have hustle, right? And you can build knowledge, but the money one is the hardest one to come by at the beginning. Did you focus on one of those areas more than the other at the beginning?
Yes. Knowledge, I certainly focused on at the beginning because when you're coming in fresh, you have zero knowledge, especially of landlord laws. Where does your security deposit go? Do you have to keep it separate? All these little details that are really important, you don't really know about. Tenant screening is one. I spent a lot of time on that when I was in college, learning what is important and how do you filter out a tenant that is highly probable to be an on-time paying tenant that stays for a while versus one that pays once and then ghosts you or lives in there for a while not paying. I definitely focused on the knowledge portion first. And I think part of that knowledge portion, I did a lot of DIY. So like I sanded my own floors and painted my own walls and installed my own countertops, some of that stuff. I invested some time into that knowledge, which I think has turned out to be valuable. It's good to be handy. But as you grow, the knowledge that you need to focus on changes. And so now the knowledge that I'm focused on is more so raising private capital. How do I provide opportunities to people with money in order for them to grow their own capital and grow their own retirement funds so that they can live a better life and we can also do more deals. And the more that, like I said, I've grown, the more I've changed the knowledge that I'm seeking and some of the daily actions that I'm taking so that we can grow that portfolio better and more quickly.
Makes sense. And so did you view your first few investments, the quadplexes, and then you said the 19 unit, were those kind of a proof of concept to, hey, let me apply this knowledge, see if I can actually execute on the things you built a business plan? Did you bring in any outside money for those, or were you using those as like a proving grounds so that you could confidently go to investors?
Yeah, first two ones were my own money and bank financing. And so I used bank financing and my own money to house hack a couple times to buy my first couple apartment complexes. And then I started looking at partnerships and doing some smaller partnerships where the stakes are lower, still keeping it as a training grounds type thing, learn something, learn another thing. And as I've grown that portfolio, then I started to look more into larger partnerships, raising different kinds of private capital to the point where now we're doing two flips currently, and then we've got another two under contract. And we're doing that through private investors. So people who have self-directed IRAs or just money from various projects that they've sold, and they need to redeploy for a great interest rate to keep growing that capital for themselves. And so just understanding what is appealing for people and what's like a good deal for someone who's a private money lender or an equity investor, and presenting those deals to them has become a more important skill set for me now.
Makes sense. So knowledge is available in a lot of places now, right? Information, you can learn just about anything you need to for free online. Obviously, the quality of education usually scales with the investment that you have to make in it. But where did you go to learn this initial knowledge? Did you have mentors, coaches? Was it books? Like, what was your initial well of information? And then maybe we can parlay that into kind of where you go now to level up your skills.
Yeah, it's a mix. Like you had mentioned, mentors, books, podcasts, conferences. I've been to quite a few of each of them. I think I read the entire Bigger Pockets catalog before I graduated college because I was just obsessed. Between every accounting test, I'd crack open a Bigger Pockets book and try to learn a little bit more. And so that's where I started. And that gave me a good foundation whereupon I could have conversations with people who were actually investing. And then I think those conversations helped me to actually apply some of the things that I was learning in a more realistic format and ask the detailed questions that you may not be able to ask of a book, but you can once you have the base knowledge and you understand the right questions to ask of someone who's in that space. So I think it's a good idea to have a large base, a wide base where you're starting with books, going to podcasts, going to conferences, and then actually having conversations. Because I think that's where a lot of the best learning happens, is the dialogue, the back and forth.
100%. And I think a lot of people, they read the books and they listen to the podcasts and they get stuck in that world.
Yep.
And again, there's nothing wrong with that. There's a ton of information there and all the frameworks, everything you would need to apply it is in there. But like you said, the conversations, going to conferences, putting yourself in the room with other people who are actually doing what you're trying to do, whether or not you partner with them or not, just hearing the day-to-day dialogue and the application across other deals, that's worth a little more than a book at the end of the day, especially as things change so rapidly, right? The 2.75% interest rate you got in 2021 that made that deal probably work really well. Obviously, that's a very different thing right now. So having those ongoing conversations and people that are in your circle definitely make a big difference.
And
so sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say two things I want to parlay off of that. Number one is interest rates, fixed versus variable. And number two is the importance of conferences. So I'll start with the conferences part and we'll go to interest rates. In terms of the conferences, what I learned actually at my first one, I was talking to somebody and I asked him like, hey, it's my first conference. I'd love to get your perspective. What do you think I can do that would be the most valuable thing for me to learn or to do, or some sort of practice to implement at these conferences? And what he told me, I remember his name's Russell. He told me, you, instead of going into all of the sessions, you need to stay outside and talk to people the whole time. And I was like, that's weird. I paid for this conference to go in and learn stuff, and I'm not even going to any of it. But I learned they usually, especially at some of the bigger conferences, record or have the notes for those inner sessions where you can learn about what it is they talked about, but you can never go back and talk to those people that you could have met in the hallways. So it was a fantastic piece of advice.
Yeah, 100%. And so you started doing that even like at the very beginning of your journey, right?
Yep. Yeah. So that was probably 2022. I met one of my business partners there actually at one of the Bigger Pockets conferences because I was in the hallways talking to people. Met a private money lender in the hallways talking to people, just conversations, building relationships. And so that evolved eventually into me volunteering for conferences so that I'm getting in the rooms and talking to people across the nation, which is a pretty cool place to be as well. So the other thing that I had mentioned was interest rates. And I wanted to stop there because that's a huge topic. And especially in the commercial space, but obviously in the residential space as well. When I was starting out, lucked out because I had a great banker who steered me in the right direction and said, hey, I know variable sounds great because you can potentially get an even lower rate than what you have right now, but put it into perspective. Where are we actually at with interest rates historically? 2.75%. You can't get much lower. And I guarantee you it's been a lot higher. And so he said, lock this in, lock it in for 30 years. And you'll look back once interest rates go up and you'll be happy you did. And I was like, sounds good. And I am. So I think a large part of it is listening to your counselors as well and having really good people on your team that can push you in the right directions or have you see things a little differently.
That brings up another great topic, right? Because I think you're just picture your average family that's been renting for a while. Maybe they have young kids and they're going to buy their first property as owners. Maybe they call up Bank of America and just click the apply for a mortgage button,
Yep.
get assigned some random loan officer who ushers them through the process, but doesn't really provide that kind of partnership like you're talking about. I think that's like kind of a more traditional relationship people have with mortgages. But what you're talking about is you had someone who you knew,
Yes.
they knew you. I'm assuming you probably communicated the objectives you were trying to solve for, and they could help give you their perspective. And that's what they do for a living all day, every day, is they pay attention to interest rates. They know their product mix inside and out, and they can work with the people that come to them regularly and collaborate over a long period of time.
Well,
I just think that's a lesson in and of itself about treating the different people on your team like partners and with a long-term mindset instead of just, hey, let me come in and borrow some money for you for one transaction.
right.
Just curious if you have anything else to say about that.
Yeah. And I think, especially in the commercial space too, that's something that we've focused on as well as relationships, especially relationships with local banks. The more that you can have a great relationship with a bank in whatever area that you're in, the better off that project is in the long term because that bank has a vested interest in the well-being of that project. And so they're more likely to work with you. And they're also usually, when you're working with smaller banks, easier to get a hold of. So you can sit down with that person instead of having to call their like VA or headquarters in some other state or some other country. Actually having someone that you can talk to and have a face-to-face conversation with is a game changer in the commercial space where, yes, interest rates are important, but relationships are very important. And so that's something else I would say there is it translates, a lot of stuff actually translates from the residential space to the commercial space.
There's so many things I want to ask you, but I think on this same line, how do you approach kind of credibility and establishing yourself? Because if you want to build a relationship with a banker, but you're not going to buy a property for 10 more years and you want to ask them all these questions, they're going to see that from a mile away. So like, how did you, especially when you were starting, approach them in such a way that said, hey, I'm a serious buyer. This is something I plan to have be a big part of my future. And I want to build a long-term relationship with people who can help me. Like, how did you position yourself at the beginning, especially coming out of college and without the asset base that you have now?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. And I think that's something that you definitely have to be upfront about in terms of here's my position, because they're going to see it anyway. You're going to send in a PFS and their personal financial statement, and they'll see if you're a college student, this guy, he ain't got nothing. There's no asset base here. What are we going to lend against? And so just being upfront about it and saying, here's where I am. I'm a college student. Here's my goals. I have a job lined up. It'll pay me X amount, and I'm planning to do X, Y, Z in the next year or 2 years. Knowing that you have a plan and also speaking the language are two things that create an excellent amount of credibility because not everyone can talk about amortizations and terms and interest rates and what is your business plan for a real estate transaction. That's not a skill set that's widely available because not everybody studies it. And so if you study it and you have that base language that you can get from podcasts and books and some of the other things, like presenting them with research. I'll give you a story. A lot of my uncles are in real estate. They've been in construction or they've been in some type of land ownership, property ownership for a while. And they have their own stories and whatnot. But one of the pieces of advice that my uncle gave me as I was starting, and I went out and I asked him, what should I do? Is you should always go into a bank or always go into a conversation paired in some way. If you're going into a bank, you need to have your entire business plan laid out. This is how much money I need. This is the interest rate I need. This is the amortization I need. If you go in with your business plan on this is how I'm going to increase rents, I'm planning on spending this much per unit, even if you're wrong, they can see that you have some sort of plan and maybe you've done some research and they can give you a little bit of guidance there. But if you're going in completely fresh, completely green, can't speak the language, don't have a business plan, those are the conversations where they shut it down and they say, hey, that's great. It doesn't seem like you're ready quite yet. Give me a call maybe later when you have everything set.
I love it. Yeah. Obviously putting together a plan for a project like that you're working on right now, that makes sense. But at the beginning, what you're saying is that you framed it as, hey, here's where I'm at right now. I'm about to graduate. I got a job lined up. Here's where I want to be in a few years. And here's where I'm going to start right now so that they can see the story that you're trying to create and they can make a decision if they want to buy in early or not. And I think for them, there's an advantage of getting in early with someone who's dedicated and motivated because that's a long-term relationship for them where they can, if they treat you well and if you're able to live up to the things that you're telling them you want to do, it is a win. But I think some people maybe don't see their bankers or their lenders as that type of partner. They just see them as, a transaction by transaction.
Yep.
Things.
What?
Yeah,
The
that
more,
makes sense.
I think the more that you make it a relationship on every level, whether it be with your investors, with your realtors, we've had deals come to us because we prioritize our relationship with the realtors. Like we treat them well, we make sure that they're compensated and they bring us stuff that we can see early or that hasn't hit the market yet. And so the more that happens, the more that you have a better relationship with people, the more opportunity that you have. Because like bankers can do the same thing or do the same thing is they may hear of an opportunity and they bring it to you because they have a good relationship with you. But if they don't know who you are and they don't have a good relationship with you, probably won't hear of those opportunities.
Definitely. So let's talk about a related topic. So a buy box. Most people that listen to this have some idea of what a buy box is. It's the parameters that you assign to the kind of subject properties you're looking for, your return expectations, just like what type of properties are you looking for? So it sounds like yours has evolved a bit over time. But can you talk about the evolution of that buy box and then what it is right now?
Yeah, I'll start at the beginning. So I started looking at single family homes. I know we had talked about that a little before the podcast. I started looking at single family homes and trying to find homes that cash flow. And it was tough. It's really tough to make a single family home cash flow in some markets, especially some of the ones I was looking at. And so that evolved into duplexes. So some of those 700 deals I analyzed were duplexes. And then I realized this is tough to make a cash flow too to hit my goals. So then I started to look at fourplexes. And those are what I eventually bought because I saw the cash flow I was looking for. But as my investing experience has evolved, my guidelines and my buy box has evolved as well to the point where I'm not just looking for cash flow. I never was just looking for cash flow. I'd look at the location as well. I'd want to make sure, is this a decent area? Yes, no. Okay, can I improve the rents a little bit? Yes, no. But now I look really deeply at what is the actual stabilized value of this asset, the after repair value, ARV, what in single family, what is the stabilized value? And can I be all in at 70% of that? That's essentially my goal these days. And that a lot with flips, they call it the 70% rule. But even in commercial real estate, that's what I was talking about earlier, right? A lot of things translate. That translates into commercial real estate too, because then you have a huge equity base, about 30%, where if you're all in at 70 and you have 30% equity on top of that, you're very likely to get great returns for your investors and also be able to refinance out and maybe even get all their cash back out so they can invest in another deal. So the more that you have that mindset of forcing appreciation of value add, the more able that you are to then boost your returns for your investors, do more deals, get more deal flow going.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Remote Real Estate Academy, the community I launched last year where I personally coach investors and empower them to buy rental properties anywhere in the United States. My business partner Nathan and I have a collective 15 years experience with over 20 cash flowing out-of-state rental properties. We provide a step-by-step playbook on how you can build your own portfolio and start accessing the life-changing benefits of real estate investing starting today. Go to remoterealestateacademy.com for more info, or better yet, shoot me an email at aaron@aaronamin.com with subject line RREA, and I'll throw in a special bonus for podcast listeners who join the Academy. Now let's get to the show. And let's even get to the fundamentals a little bit of the difference between single family and multifamily, right? Because the value of a multifamily property, commercial property, so 5+ units, is different. Single family all the way up to quadplex, those kind of run in line with the general market. But when you talk about forced appreciation, just improving the profitability, the net operating income, so raising the rents, making improvements that you can get a kind of return on in higher rents, bringing the expenses down, like all those things can get you to that valuation that would allow you to meet those rules. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's exactly correct. Yeah. In single family or even small multifamily, like you said, they're entirely based on comps. It's based on what is the property down the street selling for. Whereas for commercial multifamily, there's a lot of ways in which you can improve the value of the property and drive returns for your investors outside of what does the property down the street do. You can focus more on, can I reduce expenses in some way? Can I bill back utilities? Can I make utilities, if I can't bill them back, more efficient by installing LED light bulbs or water flow efficient toilets? The small things that we consider to be very small add up, especially over a year, a month. The more that you do the small things, increasing the income a little bit through various creative means, decreasing expenses a little bit in various means, it's multiplied in commercial real estate to increase the value by multiples of that dollar, depending on where you're buying and the location of the asset and whatnot. But each dollar that you add each month is multiplied in terms of the valuation of the property. And that's like a little deeper of a math calculation. But like you said, those are the fundamentals. You can drive the property's value much more in commercial, which is something I love because it means we're more in control of how much it's worth. Whereas in residential, you're very much dependent upon what were the realtors and what were the owners across the street able to sell this property for.
Yeah, and the same is true. Even people think of short-term rentals, Airbnbs, as like, oh, these have great cash flow. If you're making a lot of money in cash flow from a short-term rental on a single family property, it doesn't necessarily mean that it can sell for that much more, because an investor coming in is going to want to know, what would this make if Airbnb got banned from my city?
Yeah.
And if that answer is whatever kind of the normal long-term rent would be, you're right back where you were with the same value as the house down the street. So
Yep.
there's less you can do to drive up the value by how well you operate a single family. There's almost nothing you can do unless it's on a really long-term lease. So I feel like once you see that forced appreciation potential on commercial, it's hard to unsee it and you want to do it. But with that said, there's a lot more skill that goes into making those operational improvements, figuring out, hey, this place hasn't been updated in 15 years. Maybe I can go in and make these small upgrades that will allow me to rent it for $300 a month more. Like, those are skills that you have to gain. I'm assuming some combination of studying and just like getting out there and maybe working with other experienced partners. But like, so let's say somebody hears this and they love the idea of, okay, let me go find some value add commercial properties. Where do you go to learn those skills, especially if you're coming maybe from a single family world?
Yeah, there's a lot of resources. There are, for example, Best Ever Commercial Real Estate. That's one that I'm associated with. I volunteered at their conference for the past couple of years, and I've been able to meet some great operators, great people that have gone to that conference and learned a lot from them. So it's similar to the way in which you would learn residential, and that you're still listening to book or listening to podcasts, listening to books. If you do that, reading books, talking to people, it's very much changing your network in terms of focusing on now being around commercial people that focus on that specifically. Because I think the more that you're around that skill set and those people, the more that you absorb into your own mindset, into your own investing strategy. And you had asked, what are some of the resources? Maybe Brian Murray's book, very good. It's a bigger pockets book. I think it's like Crushing It in Apartments and Commercial Real Estate. Great basics. I read that one in college, and that inspired me to think bigger, because before I had read that book, I actually saw someone else recommend it. Before I had read that book, I was like, okay, I want to do the stack method where you're doing one building, one unit, then two units, then 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. But when you start to get to 16, it's tough to buy 16 houses or even 4 like that's one a quarter. And if you're saving your own capital and trying to do that, it's very difficult. And so starting to learn about how do I buy one 16-plex or one 32-plex is much easier of a transaction, because you're just identifying one property and then you're understanding how to evaluate it versus trying to identify 16 duplexes and then manage them all after that. It's tough. Yeah. Like I said, podcasts, books, getting around people, it's very similar.
Same fundamentals. What do you know?
Exactly.
Okay, so there's a number of elements here. We touched on operations, we touched on banking, deal flow. This is probably, I think, one of the hardest that people have, whether it's single family or commercial. So I see you out there all the time. You're posting, you're making it known what you do, what you're looking for. Like you said, you're not afraid to get on the phone with people. So you're doing a lot of individual, personal kind of outreach to generate maybe some conversations. But what are some other ways that you have lead flow? You mentioned agents, and brokers. So you can have multiple angles versus just working with one person. Can you explain just some of that process and how that kind of works on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So you'd mentioned number one, just being out there, right? I think number one is don't be a silent operator. Don't be someone that people don't know what you do and they don't know how they can work with you. The more out there that you are, even to the point of sharing your buy box, we talked about buy boxes earlier. The more that out there that you are and the more that people know and understand what it is you're trying to do, the more that they can be attracted to you and help you. And so that's one thing I would focus on, is just making sure it's known. What does this person want to focus on? What do they want to buy? And then you can get that out there and people can start bringing it to you. Number two, I would say, again, is relationships. Better relationships you have with brokers, contractors, lenders, insurance agents, maybe even sometimes. The more deal flow that you can have from your personal network, where they're bringing you deals without you necessarily reaching out to other people. It's just building great relationships with people. And again, having them know what it is you do and what you're looking for. I think those are two of the biggest things. And then another, building relationships with wholesalers. I'd just say relationships overall.
Yeah, no, fair. And so like in single family, one of the things you run up against in certain states, cities, markets, some agents want an exclusivity. I wouldn't say that's super common, but there are times where people don't like when you're working multiple angles. I don't think the same is true necessarily in multifamily, but would you agree?
Yeah, I've seen that in terms of smaller properties for sure. Commercial properties, I haven't seen that as much. We certainly have we have a few relationships where they are more exclusive because we've built a great relationship with them and they have great deal flow and it's a really, mutually beneficial connection. In terms of other deal sources though, you might have a realtor, you might have some wholesalers, you might have people that you might be direct mail marketing. That's one thing that we haven't touched on yet, is like outbound marketing. And that's something that I've done a lot of in the past. I've done direct mailers. I've done cold calling. I think I cold called for 6 months straight just trying to find a multifamily deal. It was tough. It's a tough job. I found a couple deals that were interesting, but that's another path of finding deal flow is cold calling, direct mailers, relationships.
But you have to build up a lot of resilience for this, right? Because you could be doing it for 6 months and find one deal. You could find 10 deals, you could find 0 deals,
Yep.
and you have to build a pipeline and you reverse engineer the numbers, right? You
Yep.
say, hey, if I want to find X amount of deals,
Yep.
the industry average, if I use this marketing channel, is X dollars invested in this channel to produce this many leads, to make this many offers, to net this many deals. Is that how you approached it?
Yeah, I think leading indicators versus lagging indicators, just seeing that difference and thinking about it differently. A lot of times folks think about how many deals have I closed this quarter or this year? And they stop there and they think about, "Oh, man, I haven't closed any." And it's like December. That's a tough conversation to have with yourself. But when you're more focused on the input rather than the output, then ironically, that output increases. So if you're more focused on the number of offers that you put out or the number of phone calls that you make than the number of deals that you're closing, the number of deals that you're closing goes up in itself because you're focused on the things that directly impact that, which are touches, contacts, connections, and then offers made. And so I think the more that you focus on those inputs, the better your outputs will be.
Yeah, and these are general kind of sales and marketing principles, but sometimes it's hard to trust the process, especially when you're spending a bunch of money on outbound marketing and you haven't yet got your first deal. So is this where did you start with this outbound marketing strategy, or is it something you layered on after you already had some experience?
I'm more focused at this point on inbound marketing personally. So my like KPIs, if you will, are how active am I on social media? How am I letting people know what it is that I do so I can attract things to me and people to me and opportunities to me? So it's different in that I started really with the outbound marketing and I found that for me, that wasn't really effective. And like you had mentioned, you might call for 6 months and find one deal or 2 deals or 0 deals. But if I'm more focused on building relationships online with people in mass or one-to-one connections, then even if no deals come from that, personally, I find that to be satisfying. And also I'm able to help more people that way than just trying to cold call people and seeing if they want to sell their property. I found that's not really satisfying and it's hard to help a lot of people in that way. You might find a couple people that are interested in selling, but a lot of the times you're still far apart on pricing. So even if you come up with a creative solution, creative financing, but you've got bank financing, sometimes you're just too far in price. And so when you focus more on the relationship, maybe that'll turn into a deal eventually. But even if it doesn't, you may have great lessons you learn. You may have great experiences that you have with that person. And so I try to focus more on building those relationships and have that being my input than the alternative.
That's a huge mindset shift. A lot of people, I think, maybe struggle with, especially people that are busy or working, full time or part time. And this is maybe something they are interested in on the side, is like believing in the long term relationships and that, hey, this person I'm talking to, the fact that I'm having a conversation with them at all and having the opportunity to learn what it is, maybe how they got into a specific opportunity or what they're looking for, just to better understand how do people operate in a day-to-day basis, like that in and of itself is its own type of win.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just focus strictly on, did I close a deal?
Yep.
Then you're going to get discouraged pretty quickly if you're trying to play a long game, and especially if you're trying to scale.
Agreed. Yeah. And I'd add on to that and say, like, when you're making those phone calls, let's say you're cold calling someone and your whole mindset is, I need to close a deal. People will sense, they'll feel that ulterior motive as you're talking to them, and the tenor and the tone of that conversation will shift. Whereas if you go into it with a relationship focus and a relationship lens, then the tenor also shifts and the tone also shifts because you're focused more on having something long-term with that person than, hey, do you want to sell your property? No, click.
Yeah.
That's when it gets discouraging over time. is because you're more focused on the transaction than you are on the relationship. And that's when you see a lot of the rejections. But when you're going into it trying to build a relationship, it's hard to reject that person because what are you rejecting? You're rejecting someone who's interested in getting to know you, your story, your business, how you got to where you are so that they can get there too. That's a person that I personally would want to talk to more than the person that's trying to see if they can buy my property.
100%. And part of that is in a genuine way, telling your story of what you're trying to accomplish so that they can see that, hey, this is a real person. In my case, like I'm not doing the kind of scale of deals that you're doing, but even with single family, I've found that just them, the sellers knowing that it's a family that's investing, like we're not big time trying to buy 200 properties in the same town. Like we're just scaling slow and steady. And like we write letters and we try and like actually build relationships with the people, even if we're using agents, like we try and introduce that human element. And I think that stuff does make a difference. It's always hard to know, but I do think that those touches where people can see what you're all about, it could be one of the factors between a yes or a no, or how far people are willing to go to work with you.
Yep.
And I notice when you post online, you do this cool thing where you have this same sign off at the bottom of every one of your posts. I forget exactly what it says. You probably know it verbatim, but it's something to the effect of, hey, I'm AJ Smith. I'm an Iowa native looking to do this, and hit me up in the comments if you want to chat or something. It's just like those simple calls to action. If somebody sees that enough, and whether or not those posts go viral, it's just this consistently showing up and starting conversations every day that without like necessarily filtering out, like, oh, you don't necessarily discriminate against, oh, somebody hits me up and they want to talk about real estate. You're not like, are you interested in 100+ unit commercial deals? Because if not, I don't want to talk to you. It's an open door, right?
Yeah. Sometimes I have people just call and want to get to know each other. They're not even in real estate. Sometimes I've had people who are in like tech and they just saw, hey, I saw that you do this. I was interested in learning how you do it, how you think about it. But yeah, like you said, I don't discriminate in terms of the people that want to chat with me. I just put out there a Calendly link, and whoever wants to chat, I have a conversation with. And I found I personally like to talk with a wide variety of people, whether they're in real estate, out of real estate, have invested before, haven't invested before, do small multifamily or single family or commercial. Everybody has their own story and everyone has their own path. And sometimes I can connect people with other folks who are on a similar path or can help them on that path go a little farther. And one of my favorite books is The Go-Giver. And so that's one of the things that I've taken away from it is like, the more that you focus on giving value or adding value to other people, then the more that eventually will come back to you in some way. But your focus should be on the value itself. And so that's how I approach the posting. That's how I approach the conversations as well, is trying to see how can I help these folks in whatever they're trying to do.
And do it from a place of genuity and actually wanting to help them. Because like you said, people can smell the ulterior motives from a mile away. So no, I've always admired that about you. And I think that's how you and I got connected. Was a mutual friend of ours introduced us because I invest in the Quad Cities. And she said, if you invest in the Quad Cities, you got to meet AJ. She didn't know me all that well, but she said, if you're in that realm, you got to talk to this guy. And those little connection points, whether it's you, whether it's this person I mentioned, whether it's me, those introductions, I think if you have that open mind and just follow those conversational leads and try and add value where you can, over time, that stuff spiderwebs pretty quickly. And imagine 5-10 years of that, the kind of relationships that you'll have.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and the more
I
relationships
love that.
and connections that you have, the more people that you can help too. Like the more people I've spoken to in different facets of life or facets of real estate that maybe aren't specifically related to what I'm trying to do, but I now have those connections and I know what they're able to add to other people. Like, even if I can't benefit from it, I can connect them with someone else who's looking for that thing. And so the bigger of a network, the larger network that you have, the more that you can do that for folks.
Yeah, no, I love that. So in the interest of time, because there's probably 4 or 5 other topics we could go down. The last one I think to touch on today would be partnerships. So you and I, before we hit record, you were talking about well, one of the mindset shifts you had is versus going at it alone versus trying to figure out that who, not how mentality and how you can complement other people's skill sets and build a strong partnership. So can you talk a bit on that topic? Because I know you've now expanded into, I believe, multiple partnerships, right?
Yeah, multiple partnerships, multiple areas. I think the biggest thing to recognize and understand is what are your strengths? And there's a few different ways that you can look at it. There's a book called Traction that a lot of entrepreneurs are familiar with. And the thing I would pull from that is the idea of visionary and integrator. And you're going to need both because the visionary helps you to push the business and the integrator helps take care of the details. And so understanding who you are and finding your foil or the person that is the other part of that, I think is very important in growing that business. The second thing I would look at, especially in multifamily or like large scale commercial real estate, is looking at there's a matrix that I think it was the DeRosa Group, Faircloth, who's associated with Bigger Pockets, but they came up with this like 4 square method that gives you essentially 4 skill sets that folks can focus on, team up with. And so I like the way that they phrased it. It was like hunter, money, hammer, and brain. The hammer takes care of asset management and property management. The money takes care of capital raising, investor relations. The brain takes care of underwriting, making sure it's a good deal. And the hunter finds the deals and finds the markets and builds the relationships to get those. And so I think when you're looking at partnerships, of course, you want to do due diligence on your partners, make sure that they're someone that you want to do business with. But outside of that, looking at skill sets and looking at who am I and who are they, making sure that those things are matching or not matching, but are like complementary so that you are finding someone that complements your skill set and you complement theirs so that you two can go forward faster together than you can separate.
So how do you discover where you fall within that skill set? So I'm sure people have an intuition of, oh, I'm good at this, or I think like this, but how do you really dig beneath the surface and validate some of that? Because sometimes the reason I'm asking is I have found things out about myself that I didn't know, sometimes by asking other people or like doing some exercises, but I'm curious how you went about that.
Yeah. So I know for myself, there's an assessment that they offer, but just looking at track record, I suppose, in your own life, what are the experiences that you had that were impactful that you think could be valuable in the real estate space? So for me, I've always loved in school presenting things. Like I always loved class presentations, like business school projects, that kind of thing. And so as I was looking at my education, I looked at, okay, I studied as an accountant. So I could do the brain part in terms of deep, detailed analysis, making sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. Like I could do that. What did I really enjoy? I really enjoyed the presentations. I enjoyed talking to people, answering questions, making the presentations themselves, ensuring that everything was tied up in that arena. And so for myself, I've done asset management. I've done construction management. I've analyzed deals. I've found deals. I've done all that stuff. But I think the thing that I enjoy the most, and I think that's something that each person has to ask themselves, is what do they enjoy the most? What are they really good at? The thing I enjoy the most and that I've done well in the past has been more of that capital raising / presentation slide quadrant. And so that's where I've focused my attention personally. But I think in order for someone to find that out for themselves, they have to look at what have I enjoyed? What am I not quite educated in, but what do I have like good experiences with? What have I tried in the past and been successful with?
Yeah, I like that. And you were basically layered your way up the skill stack, right? Up until the point where you could focus on that. So you learned all the DIY stuff. You were sanding your own, floors. You were buying, you were property managing, screening tenants. You were doing all the groundwork so that you had a baseline understanding of how to do that stuff, which I think even if you move into a different role, knowing how the other realms operate within real estate, I would argue that's a prerequisite for long-term success. Like you can't just come in with one super narrow skill set, most likely, tell me if you disagree, and really ace it in real estate. I think you have to have some level of understanding of how the whole thing operates. But the fact that you then recognize too that, hey, you have this, you're comfortable in front of people talking, you're comfortable building a deck, you're comfortable at answering questions on the spot. That gives you then a somewhat more rare skill set to be able to be a liaison with investors. If people write you $100,000, $500,000, $1 million check, they want to know that the steward of their money can handle themselves and can navigate, not only just talk a good talk, but that they understand the nuts and bolts of the deals they're presenting. So it's cool how that kind of organically evolved for you. And then you've now carved out your role so that you can then bring that to multiple partnerships in the future. So that where you are today, it sounds like, is that the main spot you're occupying, is like that capital raiser, investment relations, or are you also involved in some of the other realms?
Yeah, investment relations, due diligence. I think we talked about on the podcast a little bit before. I'm headed to South Carolina to check out a deal that we have under contract. And so I'm still, even though I'm someone who enjoys the presentation part, I'm also very like type A, detail oriented. I love to look through all the underwriting, make sure everything is right, double check it, triple check it. And so I oftentimes take that role as well, because I like to, like you mentioned earlier, I like to make sure everything is taken care of before we're presenting it to people. And so that's another role that I tend to occupy as well.
Yeah, if an investor calls you and they ask a question, but you've never touched the soil, you've never seen the building, have an understanding of how this plan is actually supposed to play out, it's a little harder. It's not impossible, but it's a little harder to take your word for it versus if you actually are the one on the ground going out and meeting with your partners and being part of building the business plan, not just a mouthpiece for it.
Right. Talking to residents, figuring out what are some of the capital expenditures that we need to take care of. What are some of the major maintenance items that need done right at the beginning? There are things that right when you purchase a property need to be done. And then there are things that will also push revenue, and knowing what are those two things that are the most critical items right at the beginning to take care of. And what is our plan for that? And making sure that that's also double checked. Like you said, all of that's very important as well. I think it's interesting. I like it. You had mentioned earlier, it almost seems like a bank rotation program. I don't know if you've heard of those or seen those before, but basically when someone joins a bank, they see all the different aspects of the bank. Like they spend time in a few different areas. I think for real estate or private equity or whatever you want to call it, whenever you're dealing with larger properties or even smaller properties, understanding every aspect of it. So you don't just speak to it from a theoretical standpoint, but from an actual experiential standpoint, because you've been in the trenches or like you've been in with the hammer in your hand or whatever. The more that you could do that and the more experience that you have in those areas, the more credible you are as you're speaking to people because you actually have the experience to back that thing.
Yeah, no, you can't replace real life experience. And that's one of the things I've admired about your story is that it's clear that you're out there doing the work. And there's also, I think, something to be said for not putting yourself above any type of work, right? Even if you're not the hammer or not the person that's doing all the fixing up yourself or anything like that, just like being able to speak and relate at every level, whether it's a hotshot financial advisor in New York who makes $1 million a year that you're stewarding their capital, or a vendor somewhere in Iowa who probably has never met anyone like that in their life, right? Like being able to bridge those communication gaps and relate at all levels. That's something that's earned through conversations and ingenuity and putting yourself out there. It's not something you can read in a book. So I definitely admire that about how your approach to everything.
Thank you.
Yeah. This has been awesome. I want to have you back at some point because there's so many different other topics we could unpack, but this is a great overview. I think all my audience will find some really interesting topics in here. Is there any parting wisdom you'd like to leave with them? And then second, where can they find you if they want to learn more about you?
Yeah. I would say in terms of parting wisdom, one of the things that has impacted my journey the most is just being willing to ask not the right questions, but being willing to just ask any questions that come to my mind. Because when you're starting, especially, you don't know what you don't know. And the more that you ask and the more that you're willing to ask, the more that you can grow and ask even better questions in the future. And so I think for someone who's starting, or even for someone who's been in the business for a while, having that same learner mindset and being willing to identify, I don't know much about this, or I could do a lot better here. And then finding people who are good in that and asking them questions is always a good path to take. So that would be the parting words I would say. And then in terms of where folks can find me, I'm active on LinkedIn. Folks can find me there, AJ Smith. I believe it's AJ Smith on LinkedIn. And then Facebook as well. I'm active there at AJ Smith. And then Instagram as well. Young_refi is my Instagram handle.
I love it. We'll drop all those links in the show notes and make sure that anyone who wants to reach out to AJ does. And I highly recommend that you do start one of those conversations we talked about. Thank you so much for coming on, and we'll have to do this again soon.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you for making it to the end of today's episode. As you may know, podcasts are very difficult to grow organically. If you're getting value from today's episode, I'd deeply appreciate if you can take 30 seconds to leave my show a 5-star rating and review. This will go a long way to helping me reach more listeners just like you. Thank you so much in advance.